Hello, everyone. My name is Connor Gray, and welcome to the next installment in our R&D live stream series. Today, I have the opportunity to talk to all of you about Wolfram Packlets. So what are Wolfram Packlets? Well, Packlets are our technology for bundling up code and data that gets distributed in the Wolfram system. So when a lot of functionality that's part of the system is actually broken up into these things that we call Packlets. And so they're a way that code and other things can be shared and distributed in a modular way. So they're a very powerful way of creating kind of collections of content that you might want to preserve or share with your colleagues or with other users or publicly. They are an archive format for basically everything that you can extend the Wolfram system with. So as I was saying, Packlets add new functionality to the Wolfram language. That's their basic function. The most common thing that by far that Packlets contain is Wolfram language source code, and that comes in the form of .wl or .m files. But in addition to source code, Packlets can also contain things that add new features to the front end, like palette menu items or style sheets. So Packlets are a generic way of storing any kind of content that the Wolfram system can discover and kind of add into various places throughout the system. Auto-completions are also something that are stored in Packlets. As I mentioned, a lot of the built-in functionality in Wolfram system, when we who work on the Wolfram language every day want to add something new to the system that's a new area of functionality, oftentimes that will be a dedicated Packlet. A few versions ago, I believe it was 12.1, we started opening up the Packlet system so that users of the Wolfram language could create their own Packlets in an easier way and use them to distribute their content. So these days, it's very easy to inspect all the Packlets that make up an active Wolfram language installation. There's a function just called Packlet Find, and if we go ahead and run it, this returns hundreds and hundreds of Packlets. So I'm just going to show you the first 10 just to give you an idea. But you can see there's Packlets for things like classifiers for specific kinds of content. Lots of the chemistry functionality is in a Packlet, chat tools, benchmarking, all kinds of stuff are developed in the form of a Packlet that goes into the base installation of the Wolfram language. Now I mentioned that in 12.1, we first added the basic functionality for users to create and interact with Packlets. Over the subsequent versions, we've been fleshing out our technology for authoring and building and kind of going through the development process of working with Packlets. In Wolfram language version 13, we added a bunch of new tools, notably the documentation tools package, which is a tool similar in form to what we use at Wolfram Research to author the documentation that you can browse in the system. So this is a tool that enables anyone who wants to create a Packlet to write their own documentation pages that can be just as full-featured as those that are built into the language. In addition to documentation tools, there's also the aptly named Packlet Tools package, which contains some functionality for building documentation, building Packlets, and inspecting the content that is in Packlets. And this is intended to be used by people who are interested in developing their own Packlets and functionality that is built on top of Packlets. Also new, just recently announced a few months ago, and in its first public release, is the Wolfram Packlet Repository. This is in the style of our existing repositories, like the function repository or the data repository, but it's the Packlet repository, and it's a place where anyone can upload a Packlet that they want to share with the rest of the Wolfram language community. The great thing about the Packlet repository is that just like the other the other repositories that we have, any content that's in the Packlet repository can be easily installed by any other user of the Wolfram language. So just to give you an example, I'll take one of the random Packlets off the front page. Let's say Wolfram Packlet CI/CD. Packlet repository, has what we call a shingle page. It's kind of a landing page. It's where you get to say hello and introduce your Packlet to people who want to browse for interesting Packlets. And importantly, it also has this Packlet Install command on it. So if I want to try out this CI/CD Packlet, all I have to do is click to copy this install command and go back over to my my Wolfram language session and run that. And it actually goes ahead and installs that Packlet for me right on the spot. So it's a very easy and powerful way of getting your content that you want to share with others as easily as possible into other people's hands. So we're really happy to have the Packlet repository, and like I said, it's relatively new, but we're looking forward to people who want to develop Packlets, hopefully uploading their Packlets there and sharing them with the rest of the community. So that's a bit of a high-level overview of what Packlets are and what they're useful for. The rest of this talk is kind of going to be structured as kind of a deep dive into what goes into Packlets and how Packlets work, with the intention that people who want to develop Packlets can kind of learn about how you actually do that. So the first thing I'll talk about is, well, we want to make a Packlet. How do we do that? So as I mentioned, there's this Packlet tools collection of functionality that you can go ahead and load in your Wolfram Language session. And this gives you a function called create Packlet. So this is just a helper that will create the initial content for a new Packlet. Create Packlet, it takes two arguments. It takes the name of your Packlet, and it takes the directory where you want to create that new Packlet. Now, you might notice that this Packlet is actually made up of two components. I'll note that this is not actually a file path. This is the identifier for the Packlet. And the first component is made up of what we call the publisher ID. This identifies an individual or organization who is kind of the authority for this Packlet. They're the publisher, they take responsibility for what's in it. The second is just what we call the base name. This is the descriptive name for what the Packlet's actually about. So if you were writing a Packlet that was all about chemistry, say, this would be chemistry. So I can go ahead and run this code, and we're going to see that it's going to create a new set of files on my desktop. You can see this directory just popped up over here. I can go ahead and just double check, confirm with the system what it thinks the location of that Packlet is. Just make sure that file path looks right. And we'll go ahead and open up a file browser just so we can poke in that. So what did this create? Well, it created a couple of things. It created a packletinfo.wl file. Now, the packletinfo.wl file is technically, it's the only file in a Packlet that's actually required to exist. It's the metadata that describes that this directory is a Packlet, and it includes things like, if I just preview this file here, it's got a Packlet object, which is kind of the Wolfram Language symbolic representation of what's in a Packlet. And we can see in here, it's got the name that I specified to create Packlet. And it's also got the publisher ID and various other things that I'll go into detail in a moment. So created that Packlet info file, and it created some other things that we're going to have a look at. So, right, it's basically what I was just saying, but it created this Packlet info file in here. And yeah, that's the description of what's in the Packlet. The name, like I mentioned, that we passed to create Packlet is the first field in that metadata info. I'll just mention, actually, this name is what shows up. I mean, this is like the display name for your Packlet. It's what shows up on the Packlet repository. You can see when I was back here on the Packlet repository website, every Packlet has a name, Wolfram / something, or me, kind of things. The next field is just this publisher ID field. This is, like I said, this is the authority. This is kind of the person who owns this. Many people do. The name will be different for each Packlet, but the publisher ID will be the same because they're all your Packlet. And just to see, so that publisher ID is actually, it's part of our Wolfram resource system. So if you've ever published something to the Wolfram function repository or one of our other repositories, you'll have a publisher ID. If you don't, there's an online form where you can just go ahead and register your publisher ID. It's very easy. But once you've done that, inside the Wolfram Language session, if you're signed in, $publisher ID is going to be that same value. If you're not signed in, you can use Cloud Connect to go ahead and connect. Next up is a version field in the Packlet info. So this just distinguishes different releases of your Packlet. So you release initial version of your Packlet, that might be some small version number like this. Maybe you go straight to publishing a 1.0 version. That's up to the author to choose. But as you make changes to your Packlet, you'll increment one of these version number components as appropriate for the size of the change that you made. So version is just a way to signal to users of your Packlet that there's new content available, and how different that new version of your Packlet might be from existing versions. As a note, we strongly recommend that Packlet authors adhere to the semantic versioning standard. This is mentioned in the Packlet Repository guidelines, which you can find on the Packlet Repository website. But semantic versioning is just a convention that makes the numbers in a version number significant to users, or interpretable. So that's the version field. Next up is the Wolfram version field. So this is the thing that declares what versions of the Wolfram language your Packlet is compatible with. So let's say you write a Packlet first in Wolfram language version 13.0. You might declare that your Wolfram language version is, well, 13.0. But let's say, a little while later, we've released Wolfram language version 13.1, and you decide there's a new function that's in Wolfram language version 13.1 that you really want to use in your Packlet. That's a-okay. You just have to remember to be sure to update the Wolfram version field of your Packlet to reflect that you're using content, new functionality from Wolfram language version 13.1. This is a way of signaling to users of your Packlet whether or not they can actually use it or not. If somebody's running Wolfram language 12.3 and you've declared, that it's only compatible with 13.1, that'll let those people know that they're not able to use your Packlet without upgrading, which is important because if they were able to use it, some things might go wrong if there were functions that didn't exist in the older version that you were using in your code. So that's Wolfram version. So far, all the fields we looked at were they're kind of metadata about the Packlet, but they're not really the meat of the Packlet. The extensions are where we really get into kind of real content that's the thing you're actually trying to distribute as part of your Packlet. As I mentioned, the purpose of Packlets, the reason we have this technology is that they are, excuse me, they are a way of extending the Wolfram language with new content. I mentioned primarily that new content comes in the form of code, but other things are allowed as well. So anything that can be in a Packlet that extends the Wolfram language with new content is something that's declared in the extensions field. So I mentioned that primarily it's code. That's the kernel extension. So if you have code that you want to add to the Wolfram system, you create a Packlet that has a kernel extension. The kernel name it just means that what you're adding is kind of extending the language in some way. You're adding new functions to it. You might just think of this as, this name is, has a certain history that is why it is what it is, but it just means code, basically. Now, in this extension, it takes some options. The first is the root option. This just specifies what file directory the files associated with this extension are in, because we call it kernel. By convention, the kernel extension is going to be stored in a directory called kernel. Excuse me, sorry. Just drink some water real quick. Sorry about that. Right, so that's just the directory that those files are going to be stored in. Next up is the context option. So this is where the Wolfram language context for the package that you're writing is declared. And what I mean by context is anything that you can pass to the Wolfram language get or needs functions. So you saw in the code I ran earlier that I evaluated needs of Packlet tools. Well, the reason I can do that is that there's actually a Packlet in the system called Packlet Tools that declares a kernel extension, and that kernel extension specifies a context called Packlet Tools. So that's how the system knows when I evaluate needs of Packlet Tools where it should find the source code associated with that. And just to peek under the hood a little bit, the way that actually works is that there's a function in the language called find file, and if you give it a context, it goes off and tries to find what file it should load when you do needs on that context. And we can actually see here that it's going and finding, I have Packlet Tools version 0.0.12 installed, and it has a kernel subdirectory, and inside that subdirectory, there is a packlettools.wl file. So that's the actual file that gets loaded when you evaluate needs Packlet Tools. And just like for Packlet Tools, as for any custom Packlets you might have, it's the same process. When you declare a context in the kernel extension, that makes that context known to find file and needs and all and related functions. Right. And so just to be clear, the context that you specify, by default, it's going to look for a file that has the same name as the last component in the context. I happen to spell it out explicitly here using this alternate form where a context is mapped directly to a file name. But you could just as easily just say context arrow the context itself. But that's how the system knows what file is associated with that context. So just to illustrate, in the previous step, I created this Packlet. So this Packlet exists. It's on my desktop right now. But at the moment, the Wolfram language doesn't actually know that it exists. And the way I can prove that is if I do needs of, oh, maybe I did load it in an earlier step. Well, OK. I guess I did load it. But by default, when you use create Packlet, it creates some files on your system, but it doesn't actually load your Packlet into the Wolfram language. So I've got a fresh session here. Oh, you know what? I think I have a previous version of this Packlet installed from the last time I gave this presentation at the Wolfram Summer School a few months ago. So that's why that's not doing what I expect. I'm expecting this to error. Let's just try this one more time. Right, there we go. OK, so now it's working as I expect. Right, so I created this Packlet. It's on my desktop, but the system doesn't know about it unless I tell it about it. So if I try to do needs of that context, the system says, hey, I don't know anything about this context. So if I want to tell the system about my Packlet, one way to do that is a function called Packlet directory load, which I just give it the file path to my directory or to my Packlet. Oh, and OK, well, that's not defined, but I know that path. So right, so if I do Packlet directory load of that file path, now system is telling me, OK, this file path has been added to the list of known Packlets. And now if I run needs of my Packlet, I don't get an error that it returns nothing. That just means it was loaded successfully. And if I use find file, it's going to tell me the location of that file that it's loading for that context. And all of that, again, happens because I've declared that context field in the Packlet info file. So the system knows about my Packlet, and the Packlet tells the system about this context that it has. OK, so that's kernel. That's extending the system with new code. But like I said, Packlets can contain things other than just code. The other most common thing that they typically contain is documentation, and especially Packlets that are authored by external folks, folks who don't work on the Wolfram language. These are, documentation is very important for making sure that people know how to use your package. And I'll go through how to author documentation now. So by default, a new Packlet contains a documentation directory, but there's not really anything in that directory yet. So if we want to add new documentation, we need to use that documentation tools tool that I mentioned earlier. Now, documentation tools is built into the Wolfram language, like I said, starting in Wolfram language version 13 and newer. And if you go into the system palettes menu, you can open it up. There it is. So if I go ahead and click on that, it's going to open up the palette. And there it is. So this is the documentation tools palette. This is all the functionality you need to create new documentation. Now I'm going to have to select here. I'm going to have to tell the palette about which Packlet I want to add new content to. So I'm going to go ahead and click that Add Packlet button and select my Packlet directory. And it's going to ask me to just confirm some information about it, make sure I've got the right Packlet. That all looks right. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now you can see it's my Packlet that's selected. And you can also see that it's created some new directories down here. Now, these are the default directories for the three most common types of documentation, which are symbol reference pages or function pages, tutorials, and guide pages. Now, I'm going to briefly walk you through how you create a basic function reference page. The palette contains all the things you need to make new documentation. All I have to do to make a new page is just hit new function page. And it's going to ask me to pick a name. Well, I'm just going to say hello. And it's going to open up a new little notebook. And this notebook is where I can author my documentation. So these notebooks are actually what they're very work on when we're writing new documentation. They have a kind of the name of the symbol that's being documented. This is what we call the usage message. So this is kind of a brief one-line description of what your function does. So I happen to know that this say hello function is gonna, well, it's gonna greet people. So it takes a name parameter, and I'm gonna say that say hello prints a greeting message saying hello to the named person. So that's a basic piece of documentation. Now a couple of things. This name here, because it represents a function parameter, we often don't want to style it just as plain text. We want to style it kind of in a italicized way that it kind of represents something that can be any value. And the way we do that is this template input button. So that just turns that parameter into a template argument. And if I go ahead and click that, it asks me if I want to make that a link or just format it. Well, I don't want to link anything, so I'm just going to say format. And I'm going to do that not only in the parameter, but also where I reference the parameter in the documentation message. So I'll go ahead and hit template input again. Say I just want to format that. And now you can see that name is kind of appropriately styled for being a function parameter. So that's the basic usage message. You can do more complicated things in these notebooks. You can link to related tutorials or tech notes. You can put in arbitrary links to other web pages or other functions and things in the system, or not functions, but other things in the system. You can add in links to other symbols, and you can add in links to other guide pages. You can also include examples for your functions. So you'll want to include the examples initialization. This has been filled out by default, but you can put other code in here if your Packlet's more complicated to load. This is just something that gets run for every example. And then you can write a basic example. So I might say, I want to specify that I want to be putting in text. So I'll just go ahead and use the insert text button to insert some plain text. And I'll say, say hello can be used to print a greeting. That's my textual description. And then I'll just say hello of, I don't know, $username. Okay, so that's my example. Now, one thing I forgot to mention, but is important to realize, is that the create Packlet function, it actually generates a .wl file for you as well. This is just a kind of placeholder that you'd fill in with whatever the content of your Packlet's going to be. That placeholder happens to define a bit of code in our standard package format convention. So it begins with a begin package statement and kind of has a declaration of all the public symbols in that package. And it provides a very basic definition for this placeholder say hello function. And because it does that, I can actually evaluate this example here. And it works. But that's not magic. It's just create Packlet, creating some placeholder content. You're expected to change what's in this file to suit the Packlet that you're the package that you want to write. Okay, so cool. So now I have a very basic function page, and you'll notice right off the bat, this obviously looks pretty different from the documentation you see in the system. And that's because, as it says up here, this is actually a function page authoring notebook. Documentation notebooks go through a build processing step to actually transform them into the kind of final pretty form that they have in a finished Packlet. So we can build documentation as well. The Packlet tools package that I mentioned actually has functionality for building documentation in it. It's got this Packlet documentation build function. If I go ahead and, excuse me, I'm going to just set this so that I can use it. Okay. Oh. If I go ahead and run this Packlet documentation build function, pointing it at my Packlet, I'm going to call your attention to the files over here on the right, because it's actually going to produce some new files, which are the built documentation. Well, I restarted my system earlier because of that problem, so I'm going to have to load Packlet tools again. That's pretty simple. So there we go. It's loading Packlet tools. And now and I forgot to evaluate that again. Okay. All right. So now it's going to load Packlet tools. We get some warnings here because we haven't included some version metadata in our file. That's okay. But you can see that it's actually created this new build directory over here inside of our Packlet. This build directory contains a layout of files that's basically identical to our source Packlet. But because we've only asked it to build documentation, it's only put the documentation in here. You can see it's also actually created some new files. There are these search index files. These are just metadata that allows efficient searching when you have this Packlet installed and you want to search for something in it at the documentation center. But what we really care about is the built version of that page we just authored. So if I go ahead and open this up, it's going to pop up over here. So yeah, so this is our built page. Obviously, it's got all the same content as in our authoring notebook, but it's styled just like the documentation that's in the Wolfram language that I'm sure all familiar with. So the point here being that these are the same tools that we use to author documentation every day, and they're available to users, and anyone can use them to author their own documentation. So that's building documentation. So what if I want to actually share the Packlet that I've been authoring with other folks? The way I do that is using the Packlet Build function. So I just use the Packlet documentation build function to build only the documentation. Packlet Build actually goes a step farther and builds all of the content that's in my Packlet, not just the documentation, but it copies in the Packlet info file and my source files as well, and any other content that I might have in my Packlet. Now, importantly, Packlet Build, you'll notice it doesn't copy in this resource definition notebook up here, which I'll get to it a little later describing what that is. But suffice it to say, this notebook is not considered part of my Packlet. And Packlet Build knows that, so it doesn't actually copy it into the build directory, which is exactly what we want. And likewise, it's common for, you might have a README file in your Packlet, you might have some private scripts, you might have documentation that you don't want to share with other people. That's all fine. Packlet Build knows not to include any files that aren't declared in your Packlet info file. So because we don't have any extension in our Packlet info file that references this resource definition notebook, Packlet Build knows not to include it. So that's Packlet Build. Now you can see Packlet Build, in addition to creating these other files in here, it's also created something entirely new, which is this .packlet file. This is actually an archive format of the Packlet. It's got all the Packlet content in it. So this is the file that you'd want to share with people you work with, or friends or colleagues who want to try out your Packlet. So you could email it to them if you want. These days, we'd probably encourage you to upload it to the Packlet Repository and let everyone benefit from it. But the choice is yours. So once you have a .packlet file, and you want to actually use it in the Wolfram language, maybe you sent it to somebody and they want to know how to use it, it's real simple. There's a Packlet Install command. And if you run that and pass it the file path to that .packlet file, it goes ahead and installs it in your system. And now if I quit my session, so I'm starting over fresh, but I asked the system, where is Connor Gray backtick my Packlet? It actually still knows about my Packlet because I've installed it. So when you install a Packlet, that's making it persistently available, and that Packlet will stay around until you uninstall it. And you can see it's placed it in an appropriate directory on my system, and there it is. So if I decide maybe I'm done with this Packlet, or maybe it's an older version I want to get rid of, you just say Packlet uninstall, and Now, if you try to load it, system doesn't know about it anymore. But you can uninstall and install as you wish. Oh, and I should mention, importantly, let me go ahead and install this again. Well, here. So I'm going to go Packlet Install, and I'm just going to give it the path to, here, I'll just browse to it. Give it that .packlet file path. I'm going to run that. So I've installed it again because there's one thing I forgot to demo. So when you have an installed Packlet, not only can you load its code, you can also view its documentation in the documentation center. So if I search for that say hello function, well, the system should be able to find it. Let me see, did I? Well, let me just see if I say Connor Gray, my Packlet ref, say hello. There might be, yeah. Well, okay, there's clearly something wrong with my installation, but normally that works. You can just search for the function that you've defined, and it's going to show up in the search results. In fact, I think I know probably what the problem is, something I was changing earlier. But anyway, just like built-in documentation where you can just search for it in the help browser, users of your Packlet will be able to search for it and have the help pages show up. And this works for function reference pages, it works for tutorials, it works for guide pages. It also works for content in your Packlet. So if this is working properly, if I wanted, I could search in the system, say greeting message, and it would list this page as a result because it knows to index keywords and things in the documentation. So that's building in this documentation and viewing it. Now, there are a couple of choices if you want to share your documentation online, say. Now, obviously, the Packlet repository is where if you want to share public code, public Packlets, that we definitely recommend you deploy it. But there are other options if you want to deploy maybe to your own private web server, or you want to deploy maybe a pre-release version of the Packlet that you don't really want to put on the, you don't want to announce on the public Packlet repository. There are a couple options. So yeah, just reload this. So the one option is you can use Packlet documentation build and specify a second argument, which is going to be the destination for your built documentation. And you can actually specify a cloud object. And if you do that, let's see if I've got, yeah, it's not, haven't done that yet, but you could run this. Though this is good if you really want documentation that's in your own private cloud account and you only care about documentation. There's actually a better way these days, which I'll show in just a minute. But this is built based around cloud notebooks. If you want to deploy raw HTML, I mean, for example, if you have your own private web server and you don't want to rely on, say, linking to pages on the Wolfram Cloud, you just want it to be on your website, you can also use Packlet documentation build to generate HTML. Now, I won't go into this example just because I don't have a lot of time left, but suffice it to say, if you have a look at the documentation for Packlet documentation build, it goes through how you can either deploy that HTML to the cloud, just as an easy way to test out that it works, or you can specify a file path in here, just a place on your computer to build that HTML, and then you can deploy it to your web server if you want. Right, so that's kind of the end of the main part of this talk. There are a couple things I'm going to still talk about related to the Packlet repository and this resource definition notebook. But I'll quickly mention this Packlet repository I keep talking about. We've got a nice URL for it. It's packlets.com. Hopefully everyone can remember that. But if you go there, that's just going to take you to the home page of the Packlet repository, like I showed you before. And from here, we've got documentation on how you can use things from the repository, create your own Packlets, and you can also browse through all the Packlets that are currently published. And if you publish a Packlet to the repository, it's going to end up being shown in this list as well. So it'll be easily discoverable by everyone who browses the repository. I also mentioned that I happen to have, I've assembled a collection of resources that are, I think, useful for people who are developing Packlets. This collection of internal documentation It's a collection of some conference talks that have been given in recent years by myself and others who work on the Packlet system. I can put, well, let's see, I guess I can't put the link in chat since this is a live stream, but I've got a QR code here for anyone who wants to scan that. That's a useful set of resources. It includes recordings like talks like this one, and it includes links to all the relevant documentation that's in the Wolfram language about Packlets. So I mentioned the last thing I'm going to talk about is this resource definition notebook. This is the way that you actually, if you want to publish a Packlet to the Packlet repository, this is how you do it. So this is kind of a set of tools for preparing your Packlet for the repository. The notebook itself is the content that's going to appear on that home page for your Packlet. So it's, you can write a description of your Packlet. You can include an image. So this is kind of the what you'd call the hero image, the thing that maybe grabs people's attention about your Packlet. You can have longer descriptions. You can link to the main guide page, kind of the main list of functions that are in your Packlet. And you can include some maybe high-level examples just to show people who are browsing the repository what your Packlet's all about. So that's this. There's some other metadata in here about maybe you want to fill in the source code location of your Packlet, your name, obviously, things about software licensing. If you want to be sure to tell people what terms they're allowed to use your Packlet under, and some categorization things I won't go into. But this is all about kind of describing your Packlet so other people know what it's about and how they can use it. This notebook has a number of other useful functionality in it. It has there's a check button which will kind of run linting and code analysis over your Packlet and tell you if there's anything that looks wrong or suspicious. Maybe a mistake you made or a piece of information you forgot to include. You can see it's telling me I haven't written a description, and there's a file that's out of date and things like that. You can also build here. So this, if you click build all, that's essentially equivalent to running Packlet Build yourself. So it'll actually, if I hadn't already built, you can see it's reprocessing the files in here. Crucially, it includes a submit to repository button. No, I'm not going to click it because I don't want to submit this example Packlet, but this is what you would click if you wanted to share your Packlet with the world on the Packlet repository. But it's also got this deploy button tucked in here. And this is a way that you can actually publish your Packlet publicly or semi-publicly without actually having to make it indexed on the Packlet repository. This is a great way if you want to maybe share your Packlet with just a couple of people, or you're not ready for kind of a wide announcement of it on the repository. This deploys your Packlet under your personal cloud account. So you can see in the URL here, this is under my personal cloud account. And this is a shingle page that looks just like it would look like on the Packlet repository website. So deploying it to your own cloud account is another great way. If say you're working on the content in that notebook and you want to check that everything looks right when it's deployed to the web, you can just use that deploy button and say, only deploy to my cloud account, and you can just check that everything looks okay. But these deployed Packlets can also be installed directly, just like the Packlet repository shingle pages. These have a click to copy Packlet install command, and anybody who has access to this link can use this. So it's another great way if you want to share your Packlet with a limited group of people. Okay, well, I guess I think that's everything that I wanted to talk about. Thank you all for coming. If there are any questions, be sure you get them into the Zoom chat, and they'll be forwarded along to me. Or I said not Zoom chat, I should say live stream chat. But yeah. Okay. Oops. Okay, well, maybe that wraps things up. Thank you all for, oh, I'm being told there is a question. Let's see. Okay, someone's asking, can one have a private Packlet that has an encryption scheme? In other words, could I publish Packlets semi-publicly and then sell them with textbooks? So we don't have any functionality, pre-built that allows you to do some kind of obfuscation or encryption scheme. But you can, if you have a scheme that you think would work, I know some people will obfuscate their Wolfram language source files. That's an option. We won't prevent you from doing that, but we don't have any pre-existing tools that are specialized for doing that. I'll mention, if anybody has tools like that, a Packlet that provides encryption functionality for other people's Packlets would be a great Packlet to submit to the Packlet repository. But yeah, we don't at the moment have anything like that that already exists. Craig Carter's asking, how are things sandboxed so that a Packlet author can't include, for example, delete file or presumably other kind of dangerous content in their Packlet? So it's important to note that there is no sandboxing for Packlets in the repository. It's just Wolfram language code, and that means that anything you can put in Wolfram language code, including potentially dangerous things, can be in Packlet repository Packlets. Now we go to some effort to try to verify and warn folks if a Packlet contains some potentially dangerous or destructive content. Malicious content, intentionally malicious content is not allowed on the Packlet repository, and people should definitely report anything like that they notice, and we do proactively check for that kind of thing. But it's one of the reasons that the publisher ID is an important part of the Packlet name is that's the person you're trusting if you want to install one of these Packlets from the repository. And if there's somebody who's published a Packlet that you don't trust, it's important that you'd want to verify, you'd want to look at their Packlet, make sure it's something that seems reasonable. Try to only install things from people and trust, or institutions that you can trust. One thing I will mention, people who've submitted to the Wolfram function repository before know that the function repository has a built-in review mechanism. It's actually, we have humans who look at submissions and validate that there's nothing nefarious in them. That's not the case for the Packlet repository. The Packlet repository is intended to be kind of a more community wide open kind of thing. It's a place where if you have, say a Packlet's only partially finished, it's not fully polished, it's incomplete in places. It's an unmoderated forum where you can get something out there into the world quickly. So that means when you publish to the Packlet repository, your Packlet actually shows up, virtually instantaneously. It doesn't have to go through the review process that function repository submissions go through, which can sometimes take hours or up to a couple of days. So the Packlet repository is a truly public resource that anyone can publish anything to, but obviously anything nefarious we'll take down. Let me see. Are there any other questions that I should know about? Let's see. Okay, well, I can't find any active questions, but anyone who has some is welcome to reach out to me. My information's, I'm on Wolfram Community, you can message. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation. And I definitely encourage you to attend the next presentation, which is happening next week. We're doing these every Wednesday. Excited to meet with all of you. And back soon. Thank you. Bye.